On a cold Thursday morning in Callaway County, Kentucky, in the spring of 1998, the bank's senior attorney walked into the foreclosure office carrying a single survey map, and before anyone could ask why he had interrupted the morning meeting, he quietly said, "Stop the transfer," words that immediately caught everyone's attention because the foreclosure had already been approved. The buyer had already delivered the certified check, and the deeds transferring 720 acres were scheduled to be recorded before noon, leaving the regional manager to ask what had happened, only for the attorney to place the survey across the conference table and calmly reply, "We don't own the 720 acres anymore." Confused looks spread across the room because nothing about that statement made any sense. And as the attorney slowly unfolded the survey, he explained that 10 years earlier, the bank had auctioned a narrow parcel of land for just $12,000 after deciding it wasn't worth keeping, though what seemed like an ordinary sale at the time had quietly become the biggest mistake the bank had ever made, causing one of the executives to ask how a $12,000 purchase could possibly affect 720 acres, while the attorney rested one finger on the faded survey and answered with quiet certainty, "Because everything that happened today began with that auction." Words that left the entire room staring at the map, realizing they were looking at a problem that had been waiting 10 years to be discovered. If you enjoy stories about ordinary people who quietly outthink powerful institutions, take a moment to subscribe, because by the end of this story, you'll understand how one forgotten bid changed the fate of 720 acres. 10 years earlier, on a windy Friday morning in the autumn of 1988, fewer than 15 people gathered inside the Callaway County Courthouse for what everyone expected to be another routine foreclosure auction. And when the auctioneer announced the next parcel for sale, several people smiled before the bidding had even begun, because nobody in the room believed a narrow 12-acre strip running along the eastern boundary of the Miller property could possibly be worth $12,000, especially with the 720-acre tract still waiting later on the schedule. The auctioneer glanced at the survey, cleared his throat, and called out, "Parcel 14B. Opening bid, $12,000, before allowing the room a few quiet moments to respond, though the silence only seemed to reinforce what everyone already believed, because most of the investors had come for the larger properties, leaving one man near the front row to joke that the bank would probably spend more maintaining the parcel than anyone would ever make from owning it. A remark that drew a ripple of laughter through the courthouse while the auctioneer patiently repeated the opening bid one more time. From the back of the room, a calm voice finally answered, "12,000, causing several people to turn toward the speaker because the bid had come from Thomas Whitaker, a 64-year-old cattle farmer whose family owned land bordering the foreclosure, and although nearly everyone recognized him, very few expected him to compete since he had never attended one of the bank's auctions before and had built a reputation for refusing to spend money unless he understood exactly what he was buying. The auctioneer acknowledged the bid, looked around the room for another offer, and quickly received $13,000 from an investor sitting near the front, though Thomas answered with 14 almost before the auctioneer had finished repeating the number, prompting the same investor to raise it once more before eventually lowering his bidding card altogether as Thomas calmly increased his offer again, leaving the auctioneer to bring the gavel down at $16,000 while congratulating him on the purchase. As Thomas walked toward the signing table, one of the bank's asset managers leaned back in his chair, smiled at the employees standing beside him, and said loudly enough for much of the room to hear, $16,000 for the smallest piece of land in today's auction. That's one way to waste good money." A comment that earned another round of laughter, though Thomas never looked up from the paperwork because he simply signed the deed, folded the receipt, slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, thanked the auctioneer for his time, and quietly walked out of the courthouse without offering a single explanation to anyone who had just laughed at him. Nobody in that room realized the quiet farmer had not come to buy 12 acres of overlooked farmland because what he had actually purchased was something the bank had failed to recognize, and before another 10 years had passed, that forgotten decision would place the future of 720 acres directly into his hands. Thomas Whitaker folded the deed, slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, and drove straight from the courthouse to the Callaway County Clerk's office, because he had no interest in celebrating a purchase that still depended on one unanswered question, leaving the deputy clerk to watch him spread 3 faded surveys across the counter before quietly requesting every highway record, boundary filing, and right-of-way document connected to the Miller property. A request that earned him a puzzled look because no one had asked to see those records in years. Though Thomas simply thanked the clerk, carried the stack to an empty table, and spent the next 3 hours comparing measurements until one detail appeared again, exactly where he had expected to find it. Every survey described the 720 acres almost the same way, but the narrow 12-acre parcel followed a completely different chain of title that had never been merged with the surrounding property. And although that difference seemed insignificant on its own, Thomas became far more interested after opening the county's original highway survey, because the county road stopped at the eastern boundary of the 12 acres, while the larger tract showed no recorded easement, no right-of-way agreement, and no document granting permanent legal access across the land he had just purchased, forcing him to read every filing a second time before requesting the original deed books to make sure he hadn't overlooked something. An hour later, the deputy clerk returned, carrying another leather-bound volume from the county archives, placed it beside Thomas without saying a word, and quietly admitted that the book hadn't been opened in decades, leaving Thomas to turn each brittle page with unusual care until he reached a highway resolution recorded more than 40 years earlier, where a single paragraph confirmed that the county had abandoned plans to acquire additional frontage along that section of road, but had never transferred access rights to the adjoining property, a discovery that caused Thomas to lean back in his chair, because the answer he had spent months searching for was finally sitting in front of him. The bank believed it had auctioned 12 ordinary acres that morning, but Thomas now knew those 12 acres controlled the only recorded entrance to the 720 acres still sitting on the bank's books, and as he carefully folded the survey before placing it back inside his leather folder, he quietly realized the auction had never really been about buying land, because it had always been about buying time. While somewhere across town, the bank continued preparing the paperwork for the larger foreclosure without the slightest idea that it had already given away the one parcel it could never afford to lose. Nearly 10 years passed before anyone inside First Commonwealth Bank had reason to pull the old foreclosure file from storage, because Parcel 14B had quietly disappeared into the archives while the remaining 720 acres became tied up in failed financing, changing markets, and a series of ownership disputes that delayed every attempt to sell the property, leaving the land sitting on the bank's books until the spring of 1998, when Blue Ridge Communities finally agreed to purchase the entire tract for a new residential development after months of negotiations that everyone involved believed were coming to a routine conclusion. The closing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. The certified funds had already arrived at the bank. The transfer documents had been prepared, and the legal department had begun its final title review, a process that rarely uncovered anything more serious than an unpaid tax bill or an outdated utility easement. Though senior title examiner Margaret Ellis slowed her review after noticing that the legal description of the 720 acres ended several feet before reaching County Route 12, a detail that seemed unusual enough for her to compare the current survey against the original foreclosure records instead of immediately approving the transfer. As Margaret spread the two surveys beside one another, she realized the newer drawing simply assumed legal access existed, while the older foreclosure survey showed a separate parcel lying between the highway and the larger tract, prompting her to request the complete file for parcel 14B, because she wanted to know why the 12 acres had been separated from the foreclosure instead of being included with the surrounding land, a question that no one in the legal department could answer from memory, because the auction had taken place almost a decade earlier. The records clerk returned carrying 2 storage boxes filled with auction documents, tax records, and boundary surveys before placing them on Margaret's desk, allowing her to trace the chain of title from one owner to the next until she reached the final transfer recorded in October of 1988, where the deed clearly showed that parcel 14B had been sold to Thomas Whitaker for $16,000 and had remained in his name ever since, leaving Margaret to request the county's right-of-way records in the hope that some forgotten easement connected the larger property to the highway without crossing Thomas's land. By early afternoon, every recorded easement, highway acquisition, and county road filing had been reviewed, yet none of them granted permanent legal access across parcel 14B, forcing Margaret to carry the entire file into the office of the bank's senior attorney because she had reached a conclusion she refused to believe without another lawyer seeing it for himself. And after nearly 20 minutes of reviewing the surveys in complete silence, he slowly removed his glasses, looked back at the foreclosure map, and quietly admitted that the problem wasn't a missing signature or a clerical mistake, because the bank had unknowingly sold the only parcel separating the highway from the 720 acres it was preparing to transfer that very afternoon. Neither of them spoke for several moments because both understood the same uncomfortable reality, and although the land itself was still worth millions of dollars, its value depended entirely upon legal access that no longer belonged to the bank, leaving the senior attorney to roll the survey into a leather tube, gather the foreclosure file beneath one arm, and walk directly toward the executive conference room where the closing documents were already waiting to be signed, knowing that the conversation he was about to interrupt would become one of the most expensive meetings First Commonwealth Bank had ever held. The executive meeting lasted less than 15 minutes because once the senior attorney spread the foreclosure survey across the conference table and explained what the legal department had uncovered, every discussion about closing schedules, financing, and transfer documents immediately gave way to a single question that no one in the room had expected to ask, leaving the bank's president to point toward the highway running along the eastern boundary of the property before quietly saying, "There has to be another way in," though the attorney had already anticipated the question and calmly explained that physical access and legal access were not the same thing because although trucks, tractors, and survey crews had driven across that entrance for years, no recorded document gave the bank or any future owner the permanent legal right to continue using it. Rather than accept that conclusion without exhausting every possibility, the bank immediately hired 2 independent surveyors, instructed another law firm to perform a completely separate title examination, and contacted the county engineer in the hope that someone would uncover an overlooked easement, an abandoned county resolution, or even an old agreement that had somehow escaped the original review, though each investigation ended exactly where the previous one had, because every survey pointed to the same boundary, every title search reached the same chain of ownership, and every county record confirmed the same uncomfortable fact: that parcel 14B belonged entirely to Thomas Whitaker. The engineers confirmed the conclusion only a few days later because every alternative entrance either crossed protected wetlands, required neighboring landowners to sell additional frontage, or violated existing county planning requirements, leaving parcel 14B as the only practical and legally approved access point to the entire development. Richard Lawson listened to the presentation without interrupting because every new report eliminated another possible solution, and after the final engineer finished speaking, he leaned forward, folded his hands across the table, and asked the one question everyone had quietly been avoiding since that morning. "If we can't build another entrance, what happens next?" The senior attorney closed the survey file before answering. "Then we stop looking for another road and start looking for Thomas Whitaker." That decision ended the meeting almost as quickly as it had begun, because within the hour the bank assembled every document connected to parcel 14B, obtained Thomas's mailing address from the county tax office, and instructed the legal department to arrange a meeting with the quiet farmer whose name had not been mentioned inside the bank for almost 10 years, while Thomas himself spent that same afternoon repairing a broken fence on the northern edge of his farm, with no idea that the people who had laughed when he bought 12 overlooked acres were finally driving toward his front gate, carrying a problem only he could solve. Thomas Whitaker had spent the better part of that Thursday repairing a fence damaged during the previous week's storms, and by the time he finished tightening the last strand of wire, he noticed a dark sedan turning slowly onto the gravel lane leading toward his farmhouse, prompting him to remove his gloves and quietly watch as two men stepped out carrying leather briefcases instead of toolboxes. A sight that told him they hadn't come to ask about cattle, weather, or fence lines. The older of the two men introduced himself as Daniel Mercer, senior legal counsel for First Commonwealth Bank, while the younger man explained he represented Blue Ridge communities, and, after thanking Thomas for agreeing to speak with them, Mercer admitted they were there because of parcel 14B, words that caused Thomas to glance briefly toward the eastern field before inviting them onto the porch, where 3 wooden chairs overlooked the same 12 acres everyone had laughed about 10 years earlier. Mercer placed the survey on the small table between them, unfolded it with deliberate care, and explained that the bank was preparing to complete the sale of the 720 acres adjoining Thomas's property, though a final title review had uncovered an unexpected problem concerning legal access, a statement that drew no visible reaction because Thomas had expected that conversation for far longer than either visitor could possibly imagine, leaving Mercer to pause for a moment before asking whether Thomas had known about the access issue when he purchased the parcel in 1988. Thomas looked across the field before quietly answering that he had never bought land without first understanding exactly what he was buying, a response that hung in the air long enough for both visitors to exchange a quick glance, because neither man had expected such a direct answer, prompting the younger representative to ask why Thomas had never contacted the bank, if he knew the parcel might eventually become important. Thomas smiled faintly before explaining that the bank had owned surveyors, attorneys, engineers, and an entire legal department when the property was auctioned, adding that he had simply assumed they understood their own records better than a cattle farmer ever could, words that left neither visitor with an immediate reply because every sentence quietly reminded them the mistake had never belonged to Thomas. Mercer eventually broke the silence by admitting that everyone involved wanted to resolve the matter professionally, explaining that the development represented years of planning, millions of dollars in investment, and hundreds of future jobs for the county, before asking whether Thomas would at least consider discussing a possible purchase of parcel 14B. though Thomas never looked at the survey as he answered because his attention remained fixed on the 12 quiet acres beyond the porch. "I'll always listen," he said calmly. "But listening and selling have never been the same thing." The conversation ended far more politely than either side had expected, because Mercer realized there would be no benefit in rushing negotiations during a first meeting, leaving him to thank Thomas for his time before promising the bank would prepare a formal offer within the next few days. While Thomas watched the sedan disappear back down the gravel lane with the same quiet expression he had worn when he walked out of the courthouse 10 years earlier, knowing the people who had laughed at his $16,000 purchase had finally discovered what that forgotten parcel was truly worth, even though they still had no idea how much it was going to cost them. 3 days later, Daniel Mercer returned to the Whitaker farm carrying a typed purchase agreement inside a leather briefcase, accompanied this time by Richard Lawson, the president of Blue Ridge Communities, because both the bank and the developer believed a respectful conversation would accomplish far more than another exchange between lawyers, leaving Thomas to welcome them onto the same porch where they had met earlier that week, before quietly pouring 3 cups of coffee and waiting for them to explain why they had come back. Mercer opened the folder, slid the agreement across the table, and explained that the bank was prepared to purchase Parcel 14B for $200,000, adding that the offer reflected far more than the market value of 12 rural acres, because everyone involved understood the importance of reaching an agreement quickly, while Lawson assured Thomas the development would bring new businesses, new jobs, and additional tax revenue to Callaway County, making the proposal beneficial for everyone if they could settle the matter without unnecessary delays. Thomas listened without interrupting, read each page carefully from beginning to end, and after several quiet moments folded the agreement exactly the way he had folded the deed 10 years earlier before placing it back on the table and thanking both men for making the trip, a response that briefly encouraged Lawson because he believed the farmer was preparing to accept, though Thomas instead asked a question neither visitor had anticipated. "If I sign this today," he said calmly, "what happens to my family after the road is built?" Mercer answered that the bank's interest ended once the land changed ownership and the transaction closed, while Lawson explained that Blue Ridge Communities would assume responsibility for the entrance thereafter, though neither answer appeared to satisfy Thomas because he slowly looked toward the eastern boundary before explaining that roads lasted much longer than construction projects, developers, or bank executives, adding that the decision they were asking him to make would continue affecting his property long after everyone sitting on that porch had been replaced by someone else. Mercer immediately realized the discussion had moved beyond the purchase price because Thomas wasn't questioning the company's intentions. He was insisting that any promise affecting his family's future belonged in a recorded legal agreement rather than a conversation on the front porch. After another few minutes, Thomas slid the agreement back across the table, thanked both men once again, and explained that he would not be selling Parcel 14B because the value of the land had never depended on its size, but on what it protected, a response that left Lawson visibly disappointed because he had expected the negotiation to revolve around money rather than long-term control, while Mercer gathered the unsigned documents and admitted they would need to discuss the matter further before deciding what to do next. As the sedan disappeared down the gravel road for the second time in less than a week, Lawson finally broke the silence by asking Mercer whether $200,000 had simply been too low, though the attorney kept his eyes on the road ahead as he quietly replied that the problem was no longer the amount of the offer, because Thomas Whitaker had just made something much more important perfectly clear. He wasn't negotiating over the price of 12 acres. He was negotiating over the future of 720. The rejection forced First Commonwealth Bank and Blue Ridge Communities back into the conference room the following Monday, because no one involved had expected Thomas Whitaker to refuse an offer worth more than 12 times what he had originally paid for the property, leaving the executives to spread surveys, engineering reports, and legal opinions across the table once again as they searched for any solution that didn't depend on convincing the quiet farmer to change his mind. Over the next 2 weeks, another engineering firm was hired to examine whether a new entrance could be constructed from the southern boundary, though their report concluded that the floodplain crossing the property would require a bridge large enough to satisfy state environmental regulations, adding millions of dollars to the project before a single foundation could be poured, while another consultant evaluated the western boundary only to discover that the limestone ridge separating the neighboring farms would require blasting through protected terrain, a proposal the County Planning Commission had already rejected years earlier because of the danger it posed to nearby groundwater. The legal department continued searching just as aggressively because every attorney involved understood the project would remain frozen until someone found a lawful alternative, prompting title specialists to examine deeds dating back more than 60 years, retired surveyors to compare handwritten plats against modern boundary maps, and county officials to reopen road records that hadn't been touched in decades. Though every investigation reached the same conclusion, because not a single document granted legal access to the 720 acres without crossing parcel 14B. Richard Lawson watched the reports arrive one after another before finally asking whether the county itself could establish a new public entrance through eminent domain, a suggestion that briefly lifted the mood around the table until the county attorney explained that eminent domain could not be used simply to rescue a private commercial development from an avoidable title problem, especially one created by the owner's predecessor years earlier, leaving that possibility to disappear almost as quickly as it had been raised. By the end of the month, Blue Ridge Communities had construction equipment sitting idle, contractors waiting for instructions, financing deadlines approaching, and investors demanding answers because every week the project remained stalled, increased the cost of carrying nearly 720 acres that nobody could legally develop, forcing Lawson to admit something he had resisted saying from the very beginning. "The land isn't holding this project hostage," he said quietly as he looked across the survey. "One man is." Daniel Mercer slowly closed the file before correcting him. "No," he replied. "One man isn't holding us hostage. One man simply owns something we need, and there's a difference." The room fell silent because everyone understood Mercer was right, and after several long moments, the bank's president instructed him to arrange one more meeting with Thomas Whitaker, adding that if money wasn't the answer, then they would have to stop negotiating over the price of the land and start asking what Thomas actually wanted. A decision that marked the first time since the foreclosure began that anyone inside First Commonwealth Bank realized they had been negotiating the wrong deal from the very beginning. Daniel Mercer returned to the Whitaker farm the following Friday, though this time he arrived alone because the bank had finally realized another formal meeting would accomplish nothing until they understood what Thomas actually wanted, leaving the attorney to find him repairing a cattle gate near the eastern boundary before admitting that he hadn't come with another purchase agreement, but instead wanted to know what it would take to move the project forward. A question Thomas allowed to settle for several moments before explaining that everyone at the bank believed the negotiation was about 12 acres of land when it had never been about the acreage at all, because the day he purchased parcel 14B, He also accepted the responsibility that came with controlling the only legal entrance to everything behind it. Mercer listened carefully before asking whether Thomas intended to stop the development altogether, though Thomas quietly shook his head and explained that he had lived in Callaway County his entire life, wanted to see the community grow, and had no interest in preventing progress. But he also refused to believe that one family should surrender the only protection they possessed in exchange for a single payment that would disappear long before the consequences of that decision did, leaving Mercer to ask what kind of agreement Thomas believed would be fair if selling the land was no longer an option. Thomas looked across the 12 acres separating the county road from the larger property before explaining that he would never transfer ownership of Parcel 14B, though he was willing to grant a permanent access easement carefully limited to the roadway itself, with every maintenance obligation remaining the responsibility of the developer, annual payments replacing a one-time purchase price, automatic adjustments for inflation protecting future generations, and every obligation remaining legally binding regardless of who owned the development decades later, a proposal that caused Mercer to lower his pen because he immediately understood Thomas wasn't negotiating the value of 12 acres, but designing an agreement intended to protect his family long after everyone involved in the current negotiations had disappeared. Before returning to town, Mercer asked one final question, by wondering whether those terms would allow the project to move forward if the bank accepted them, and Thomas quietly answered that he had never wanted to stop the development because he had only wanted an agreement worth as much as the responsibility that came with owning the land. Words Mercer carried with him all the way back to First Commonwealth Bank, as he slowly realized the next meeting would no longer revolve around the price of a forgotten parcel, but around the future of 720 acres. Daniel Mercer returned to First Commonwealth Bank that afternoon and presented Thomas Whitaker's proposal exactly as it had been explained, leaving the executive committee to study the draft easement in complete silence because no one expected a farmer to reject $200,000, yet calmly propose a legally structured agreement instead. Though the mood inside the room quickly changed after the finance director pointed out that annual payments lasting indefinitely could eventually exceed the cost of purchasing the land outright, prompting one executive to argue that the bank should reject the proposal entirely because no farmer should be allowed to dictate terms on a project of that size. The senior attorney listened until everyone had finished before quietly reminding them that Thomas wasn't dictating anything, because he already owned the one piece of property every surveyor, title examiner, and engineer had agreed the development required, leaving another director to suggest filing suit in the hope a court would grant access anyway. Though the attorney immediately explained that every document reviewed during the previous month confirmed Thomas's ownership beyond dispute, making litigation both expensive and uncertain while delaying the project even longer, a reality that slowly shifted the discussion from finding a legal escape to deciding how much another year of delay would actually cost. Richard Lawson allowed the room to settle before placing the latest financial report on the conference table, where it showed construction contracts approaching their expiration dates, financing penalties beginning within weeks, and contractors warning they would redirect equipment to other developments if the project remained stalled much longer, leaving the executives to realize they were no longer comparing Thomas's proposal against the value of 12 acres, but against the growing cost of doing nothing. Though before anyone voted, the bank president asked one final question. The bank president finally broke the silence by asking whether one last offer was worth making, and Mercer quietly agreed that another meeting was possible, though he warned everyone in the room not to mistake it for another negotiation, because 10 years earlier Thomas Whitaker had walked into their auction needing them, whereas now First Commonwealth Bank would be walking onto his porch needing him. Daniel Mercer returned to the Whitaker farm 3 days later, carrying a revised agreement instead of a purchase contract because the executive committee had accepted the reality that Parcel 14B would never change ownership, leaving Thomas to invite him onto the porch once again, before carefully reading every page of the new document, while Mercer explained that the bank had agreed, in principle, to a permanent easement, though several provisions still required discussion before either side was prepared to sign. Thomas reviewed the agreement without rushing because he understood that a poorly written easement could create problems long after everyone involved had disappeared, eventually pausing when he reached the section covering future ownership and quietly pointing out that while the agreement protected the current development company, it said nothing about anyone who might purchase the project decades later, prompting Mercer to admit the omission before making a handwritten note to extend every obligation to future owners, successors, and assigns, so the responsibility would remain attached to the land rather than the people signing the document. The discussion continued for another hour as both men worked through the remaining details one by one, with Thomas requesting that all maintenance, repairs, drainage work, and liability connected to the entrance road remain entirely the responsibility of the development, while Mercer asked that emergency access never be delayed under any circumstance, leaving each side satisfied that the agreement protected both the project and the Whitaker family without giving either party unnecessary control over the other. By late afternoon, the revised document lay on the porch table with every remaining concern resolved, allowing Thomas to read the final page one last time before quietly signing his name beneath the easement, after which Mercer added his own signature on behalf of First Commonwealth Bank and extended his hand across the table, acknowledging that the matter had finally been settled almost 10 years after the auction, where both of them knew the bank had unknowingly laughed at the most important purchase made that day. As Mercer gathered the signed documents and walked back toward his car, he glanced once more at the narrow strip of land separating the county road from the 720 acres beyond it, quietly realizing that the smallest parcel sold at the foreclosure had ultimately determined the fate of the largest one, while Thomas remained on the porch watching the evening settle across the fields, knowing he had never defeated the bank at all, because he had simply understood the land before they did. The signed easement was recorded at the Callaway County Clerk's office the following week, bringing an end to a dispute that had quietly shaped the future of 720 acres for almost a decade, because once the agreement became part of the public record, Blue Ridge Communities completed the purchase before construction crews finally moved onto the property, allowing work that had been delayed for weeks to begin almost immediately as engineers staked the entrance road along the exact corridor described in Thomas Whitaker's easement. Inside First Commonwealth Bank, the file was officially closed, though few of the executives who signed the final paperwork could forget how close they had come to losing one of the largest transactions in the bank's history because of a parcel they had once dismissed as practically worthless, leaving more than one attorney to quietly admit that the bank's greatest mistake had never been selling 12 acres, but failing to understand what those 12 acres controlled before putting them up for auction. Thomas, meanwhile, returned to the same routine he had followed long before the negotiations ever began, because the cattle still needed feeding, fences still needed repairing, and the changing seasons cared very little about legal victories, leaving neighbors to notice that nothing about him seemed different, despite the fact that one careful decision made 10 years earlier had quietly altered the future of one of the largest developments Callaway County had ever seen. Long after the construction equipment disappeared and new families began driving across the entrance road every day, Few of them ever realized they were crossing land still owned by the quiet farmer who had once been laughed at inside a crowded courthouse, though Thomas never seemed interested in correcting anyone because he had never bought Parcel 14B to prove other people wrong, having purchased it simply because he believed understanding a piece of land was always more valuable than underestimating it. A lesson First Commonwealth Bank would never forget, for as long as that road remained exactly where Thomas Whitaker had allowed it to be built. Thomas Whitaker never appeared in the local newspaper, never gave an interview about the agreement, and never returned to another foreclosure auction because he believed the value of good decisions was measured by the years they continued working rather than the attention they received, leaving the people who had laughed at his $16,000 bid to remember that morning very differently as time passed, because what once looked like the smallest purchase of the auction had quietly become the one decision that determined the future of every acre behind it, proving that the bank hadn't lost 720 acres because Thomas outspent them, but because he had understood one forgotten detail long before anyone else thought it was worth noticing. If you enjoy stories about ordinary people who quietly outthink powerful institutions, make sure you subscribe, because there are many more stories like this waiting for you here on The Last Acre, where the smallest decisions often leave the biggest mark. Before you go, I'd love to know where you're watching from, so leave your country in the comments. And tell me this as well: if you had been sitting in Thomas Whitaker's place, would you have accepted the bank's $200,000 offer, or would you have protected the land with a permanent easement instead? I read as many of your comments as I can, and I always enjoy seeing where this community is watching from. And in our next story, a bank auctions a family's farm, believing the paperwork is finally complete, only to discover they never read the last page of the deed, where one forgotten clause changes everything. I'll see you in the next story.